very happy to continue our series on the challenges and meaning of sustainability for businesses today with Tom Duncan. As you know, this is an initiative of change virtual forum. We try to promote responsible behavior and responsible business in general, and we've been looking at various aspects of sustainability, on the human side, on the technical side, on the environmental side, governance side, and so forth. And now we're continuing this series with a series of entrepreneurs, and Tom is certainly one of them. And the next two ones will be also in their own way entrepreneurs in different fields that are building a path toward, I would say, a clean and sustainable economy. So we're very proud to have you, Tom. And I guess some of your CV is already on the invitation, so I'm not going to try to summarize it or to repeat it. But we are eager to know how you came to that idea and how it works, actually, how what you do works, and how you came to that idea, and what were the experience or the marketing experience that you had doing that. And after you present us with these elements for 15-20 minutes, we will then split in groups to be able to discuss and express ourselves, and then come back in the general meeting for sharing what we've our main findings are. So Tom, please, if you'd like to come in at that stage and give us your presentation.
Thank you very much, Antoine, and everyone for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and see all these faces. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to see these series ongoing and committed to transforming the state of the world in a really positive way. So I'd like to share a bit about my story, about how I came to get involved in the line of work I'm in, the trials and tribulations along the way, and some of the learnings, and yeah, also a bit about what we're doing at Earthbanc to help make a really positive impact. So I'm Tom Duncan, the CEO and founder at Earthbanc. I grew up in Australia, and my family was involved in farming as our main activities. And so I grew up in rural Australia for about half of the year, and the other half in the city, much to the annoyance of my teachers, but to the happiness of my parents and grandparents, because we would basically, all of us, my aunties, uncles, cousins, all of us, we would all converge, and we were the mobile workforce for the various family farms. So that was a lot of my youth, was growing up doing that. And some of my best memories growing up was out on farms. But as I grew older and I discovered more and more about just how difficult it is to be a successful farmer, financially, but also the sustainability. We were growing, in the late 1970s, my grandparents pioneered growing avocados in Australia in its most southern range possible. And, we were growing these orchards and grapes and citrus out in close to desert-like conditions. Now, back then, it was thought that, well, you have the rivers and you have artesian water and you have an almost unlimited supply of water, one would think, because there's so much water around. But, scientists were only just then discovering the problems of rising salt in the water tables. They were seeing more and more extreme droughts and larger, bigger dams upstream. And so there became less and less water over time. And then at times there would be floods, at other times there would be fires. We had another farm which was growing kiwi fruit in the middle of a large state forest. And that forest had to be regularly cool burned by Indigenous Australian communities. But when that system fell apart, very large wildfires would go through the area. And so when you're farming on the margins, you know, and you're in a climate vulnerable situation, you can lose all of your wealth quite quickly. And furthermore, you know, we had interest rates rise to over 20% in the 1980s. And so, you know, battling the elements and more ferocious extreme climate events, and then having a financial system that, you know, is charging you 20% interest, I got to thinking, I mean, how are farmers meant to survive in this world in that sort of context? And so this is part of my motivation. You know, we lost some family farms due to those stresses that I've just mentioned. And so this was part of my formative experience of understanding part of the problems in the world. And I guess part of what motivated me, I joined AusAid. And in 2004, I went over to China as part of Australian government's delegation. It was part of a program called Australian Youth Ambassadors for Development. And as part of that opportunity, we could join the AID program. And you know, what we were doing there was helping modernize one particular province, entire water infrastructure to create a water budget, because they had depleted the entire shallow surface water and medium surface groundwater. And pretty much all of the rivers were completely dry. And so you had a situation of hundreds of millions of farmers literally running out of water. So Australia has a lot of experience of running out of water. So hence we you know, under this AID program, we're trying to share knowledge about integrated water resources management. It was called back then, you know, whole of catchment management, where you can start to understand what are your inflows, outflows, and what is your water budget that you can sustainably harvest to direct into agriculture. And so, you know, that was at the province scale with, you know, we were producing farmer calendars that would go out to 40 million farmers. And, you know, we would go out to villages and interview farmers and ask, you know, what's the most pressing problems, you know, your top 3 problems. And then we would address them and, you know, talk about water resources management, soil water holding capacity, and building soil carbon in your soils so that you can, in fact, hold that water moisture longer when you have limited water resources to work with. And you know, crops and trees stay greener for longer in times of water stress and heat stress. And so this was that was happening in 2004. And I then worked for Melbourne Water Corporation, which is the catchment management authority of Melbourne in Australia, which was doing similar things, whole of catchment management. And you know, a large part of what I did there was do evaluation on what is the value of all of the ecosystem services that provide Melbourne's drinking water. And what we found was that, you know, the ecosystem services were literally worth hundreds of billions annually if you had to replace all of your water supply with desalinization. You know, if you don't have seagrasses to process all the nutrients running off the catchments, your bays and fish spawning grounds would invert and become toxic, and you'd lose your fisheries, your tourism. So I got to understanding the deeper role of ecosystems and the value that ecosystems provide the economy. And we created Australia's first ecosystem services marketplace, where we essentially would pay farmers to install wetlands on their farms, install buffers around their creeks so that there was more shade and there was less erosion and more integrity in the catchment and the water quality and the runoff. And, you know, paying farmers to do this was completely logical when you think it's a fraction of what you would have to pay if you have to replace all of your water systems. Now, Melbourne did in fact need to buy a desalination plant, I think, for $5.5 billion. It costs $300 million annually just to sit there idle, you know, and then if you're going to operate it, it will cost even more. So people did learn what is the cost of not managing your water resources effectively. Also, of course, there are flood issues. So this was all part of my formative years of understanding where some of the problems are at and what are some of the mechanisms that we can build upon to create better, more open, fairer and transparent ways of incentivizing farmers, helping farmers get ahead in the world by moving on to sustainable and regenerative farming. And also, how can we finance farmers and land management activities in a much fairer, better way than has been done in the past, in a more stable way? And so this really led to the development of Earthbanc. And, you know, I've got to say, in the 10 years prior to forming Earthbanc, you know, I'd been attending conferences at CO in Switzerland, you know, for 10 years. And during, you know, each year that I would go there, I would hear many of the same themes coming up again and again from speakers from all across the world of the problems they're facing. You know, what are your top 3 problems that you face? And inevitably, it is often recurring to this fact that, well, you know, we struggle to get finance to transition to more sustainable ways of doing business, whether it's farming, you know, supply chains. You know, there are issues around governance. And this brought us to, I guess, you know, identifying these recurring problems also in the carbon markets, showing that, you know, if you can help farmers increase organic soil carbon, then you could, in fact, help reward and pay those farmers for the ecosystem services they're providing, whether it's better water holding capacity, better water filtration off agricultural fields, or indeed to the climate for sequestering carbon from the atmosphere into soils. And in fact, there was a pivotal moment at CO, I think it was 2013 perhaps, when Professor Ratan Lal attended, and he's a professor at university in the US, and he won the Right Livelihood Award for his work on soil science. And his studies showed that if you transitioned 2.5 billion hectares of land to sustainable regenerative agriculture, you could in fact sequester all of humanity's emissions every year. Now, this is quite startling. Not many people know about this, but the French government, in their wisdom, in I think it was 2015, published a fantastic proposal called the 4 in 1,000 proposal. So 4 in 1,000 is what it's called. And what that proposal says is essentially what Professor Ratan Lal was saying at CO in 2013, that if we transition farming and particularly grazing to sustainable and regenerative agriculture, you can literally solve climate change, which is just extraordinary. And so what the future we see ahead of us at Earthbanc, and more broadly, the economy, governments, all the corporations and asset managers that are committed to net zero, finally they have the science at hand to say this is how you can be a big part of solving climate change, and it helps, you know, secure your food security locally and globally and regionally. It helps preserve your water resources. And furthermore, when you start tracking carbon drawdown and you start tracking supply chains, you can actually increase the finance and liquidity that goes into those markets that are often very difficult to get loans for, and where carbon starts to become a commodity that farmers produce alongside their regular crops or products that they're producing already. Just like when we were at Melbourne Water and we started saying, well, as a farmer, if you have a wetland buffer strip between your fields and the creek or river, and you are removing nitrogen from the water that's running off your land, then we will pay you nitrogen offset money. And this was very important. Otherwise, if we didn't do that, we were going to have a toxic algal bloom. All of our fisheries were going to die off, and Melbourne would have no more tourism on its bay, which is a huge employer. And so, you know, Costa Rica have been paying farmers for decades now to provide ecosystem services. So it's time we started shifting in the realm of governance, as well as corporate social responsibility, that when we're working with supply chains that come from land and water, we need to start paying for ecosystem services. Now, right now, carbon is one of the key things, you know, that people are focused on because it's very important for the climate. But equally, we can say, soil water holding capacity is incredibly important for local food security. It just so happens that by sequestering soil carbon, you're going to increase your water holding capacity, across the Sahel, across areas which have extreme droughts and also impending famine in many years. And so this is kind of a convergence point where you start to see the world can start to recognize these vital ecosystem services that the natural ecosystems naturally provide. Then you've got the land upon which people are based and the water resources. And those stewards and managers of those land, they are ultimately responsible as to whether that land and water is producing pollutants and exporting those pollutants into our oceans or into our atmosphere, or are they sequestering carbon into their soil, increasing their climate resilience, increasing their profitability so that they can get ahead in life and take care of their families. And I think that's really ultimately, the mission that we've got at Earthbanc is to enable that transition to happen. And the key ways we're doing that to enable this big shift and this big transition to a net zero world, and we are in the UN decade of ecosystem restoration as well, from 2021 to 2030. We've got 10 years or 9 years now to really do the bulk of the climate and ecosystem restoration work if we want to avert runaway climate change. And so to make this big transition happen, you need infrastructure to enable that. The Earthbanc is one of those pieces of infrastructure that is now being used. For example, one of our customers, Telia, they're a very large Nordic and Baltic telecommunications company, and they committed to net zero. And they said, well, when we want to buy carbon to offset our emissions, and be a good corporate, social, responsible corporation, how do we do that? And so when we were talking to them, we said, well, do you know much about your carbon offsets? About when they've been verified, what's the latest time that they've actually been audited? Now, most voluntary carbon markets, whether it's the Clean Development Mechanism, whether it's the gold standard or the verified carbon standard, which is, they're all the three main voluntary carbon market standards. When you buy those carbon offsets to offset your carbon emissions, and you're essentially helping farmers in the Amazon or India or the Sahel of Africa, with these projects, helping them become more climate resilient and more robust. The problem is right now that in voluntary carbon markets, the verification of that carbon only happens every 5 years. And so what we continually found was that this was a problem for one, transparency, trust, and credibility of carbon offsets as a general concept. A lot of people have said, well, are these carbon offsets even real? I mean, is the forest really being protected in the Amazon? Is the carbon really being removed from the atmosphere? Is it being sequestered? And, the Guardian newspaper, for example, ran an expose a couple of months ago about these fake carbon credits being sold. And so, you've got to tackle that head on as a big problem. And that's what at Earthbanc we've been tackling, that big problem, to say, well, how can you prove transparently that there is carbon additionality, in fact, that this activity has reduced the amount of carbon in the atmosphere or reduced pollution from happening, and is the storage permanent and ongoing? And has there been any carbon leakage? And these are the three key principles. So we went to the European Space Agency and we developed a partnership with them. And we got some venture backing and support, financial support from the European Space Agency to develop what we call the carbon monitoring, reporting and verification technology, also known as carbon MRV in short, abbreviated terms. And what that allows us to do is access very high resolution satellite imagery from the European Space Agency and all of the remote sensing data. And we can then zoom into 0.5 meter resolution anywhere on the planet. And we can acquire all of the data that we need to assess exactly how much carbon is in the trees? How much carbon is in a grassland? Even in the soil, we can tell how much carbon is in grasslands. For example, a temperate grassland where there are animals grazing, we can see exactly how much carbon is in the top 40 centimeters of soil, to within about 96 to 99% accuracy. So this is quite extraordinary that using science, technology, also we're using machine learning to really discover and measure what is the carbon sequestration. And then we do the ground truthing, where we work with local organizations to do soil samples, sample the tree forest, measure the trees, to prove, is this accurate? And then we train the machine learning models to become more and more accurate. So we're training machines to learn about how to do carbon measurement, essentially. That's what the financial support from European Space Agency has helped us develop. Now, that's solving one problem, like how to make carbon offsets reliable and transparent about, is the carbon really there? And we can do that quarterly, we can do that annually, whereas in the past, it was only done every 5 years in the industry. So it's making things much more transparent and robust. That's one clear thing that we've achieved. And now we can, in the past, if you were a carbon project, you were a farmer who only had, a couple of hectares of land, it was impossible for you to get carbon verification because it's not economic. You needed at least 1,500 acres to be financially viable to develop a carbon project, as an industry average. Now, what we're able to do with this carbon MRV using satellite imagery, we can actually get down to 200 square meters of land and help measure the carbon and help send carbon payments to those farmers. And that's really revolutionizing and democratizing access to carbon markets for farmers, where a corporation can say, well, I don't need to go to a mega project, that was probably developed by, some very wealthy people who are going to make more money off of money, and perhaps not a lot of money go to that community who's actually doing the work in farming. That's been another problem with carbon markets, that there hasn't been a transparent supply chain of how much money is actually ending up in the pockets of farmers who are doing the work or saving the forest. So you can get down to a very small size plot now. So that's one thing. Now, if you can start onboarding these farmers like we have in the Sundarbans in West Bengal and India, where my colleague Rishabh, who's on this call, is our Chief Impact Officer at Earthbanc, and he did his master's in microfinance. And what he learned was that microfinance are often providing the finance to the unbanked or underbanked, and often rural farmers. And often they're getting ripped off with exorbitant lending rates, not too dissimilar to the 20% plus interest we were paying in the 1980s, but sometimes much more. And so you start to get a situation where, imagine that if by switching to become a regenerative agricultural farmer, you could access carbon payments, but you could also access finance at a much cheaper rate than what you were doing before. And as a result of getting paid for your carbon, your credit score was actually improving. And you could start to receive finance for your regular farming activity as well as your business activities, based on the fact that you have a more resilient farm. You've got more soil water holding capacity. You're going to get more productivity. You're going to have better profitability. And, for example, there's a project we're assessing in Guatemala, a 100,000 hectare project, where their average income is $350 annually. Now, just from those 2 hectares of average sort of land that they have as a farmer, they could be earning up to $200 per year in carbon payments. And if you think for a moment what that means, that's life-changing income. That's really life-changing. That's 50% more income than you were earning the last year. So that's what we're talking about here, is, a real revolution to democratize access to carbon markets and also access to supply chain financing, making it fairer. And so really what Earthbanc, and I guess the call to action we have at Earthbanc is, we need people who want to align their own wealth with planetary health and start getting involved in our platform to help us sell carbon and also help us finance these farmers. There's 23,000 farmers in the Sundarbans that work with the microfinance institution. Now, currently, their cost of capital can be as high as 36% per annum. Now, we could get that right down through lenders from Europe, for example, from USA, from Australia, from UK. And instead, we could bring that cost of capital right down. And we know that that community is working very well. We've already helped them plant about 40,000 mangrove trees and erosion control trees through our carbon offsets program. And so we know that the carbon we're already selling is helping those farmers get ahead. And they're organic honeybee farmers, for example. And they need finance to expand their honeybee production so that they can process more honey and sell more honey. So this is the sort of situation, we're in right now in the Amazon in Peru. There's a project, they'd like to raise a €5 million bond to expand. They have a 1 million hectare project in the Amazon. They've already sold a huge amount of carbon, some of it through us. They'd like to get a 5 million loan to expand to probably another 1 million hectares to protect the Amazon and expand agroforestry. So bit by bit, we're working with the projects that already are showing success, already have the carbon revenue, and we can help expand the finance and extend the finance to them so that they can continue to expand their operations. And I guess that's what our mission is, for the next 12 months, is to onboard as many people onto the Earthbanc platform, so that people can start getting involved in supporting and I guess putting their money where their mouth is as well, so just wondering if there's any questions at this point and what my time check is, Anton.
Yeah, well, I decided to let it go a little bit further than planned, so you used your time. And so, a few questions, if possible, for good understanding of what you said, because these are fairly intricate matters. You sell your carbon credits to companies in which countries? In the Nordic countries only, or?
So we've sold carbon in quite a lot of different countries. So Sweden, Norway, UK, USA, Australia, the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia. So there's, many different countries now.
Good at spreading. And I see a hand up. I can't see exactly where, but I know someone has a hand up.
It's me, Antoine. Nick.
Oh, okay, Nick.
Foster. Tom, thank you very much for your presentation thus far. Coming from an IFC space, initiative change, there tends to be quite an emphasis on values. And the history of IFC is all about trying to get people to transform their behavior by thinking about their values. Now, what I find really fascinating about what you've done with the science that you've got involved in what you're doing is that the science is kind of the police, the policeman, the satellite capture of whether or not people are actually doing what they're saying they're doing, and indeed being able to validate what is happening. Seems to me to be a kind of beautiful marriage of values, science, and behavior. So the question I have for you is, do you think that the system that is developing, that you're starting to outline and paint a kind of global picture of, is going to be more corruption proof? Because I mean, often these systems set up in a beautiful way. They start off in a kind of halcyon fashion where we're moving towards utopia, and then some people get in the way of that, and it starts to fall apart a bit. So the question is, how corruption proof is the program that you're developing? Because it's obviously something that the future needs, but the question is the science and the values and the way in which it's being rolled out and people are approaching it? Is it going to be robust enough to avoid the corruption that human beings tend to apply when they get involved in things? That's my question.
Great questions, Nick, and I really like the articulation of how values can come through, and the technology is a key component to keeping people accountable, and the truth coming out in, is this activity really happening? Is what you say going on actually happening? And the stakes have never been higher. We've got 10 years to really start to sequester a lot of carbon before runaway climate change gets locked in. And, one analogy is, we had the global financial crisis in, 2008, where there was just a massive crisis of values. There was greed and corruption driving, essentially there were junk assets being rated as very high quality assets. They were then packaged up and sold to around the world, and it collapsed the economy. People lost their homes. It destroyed large parts of the world economically and then socially. And I think the stakes for the same dynamics happening in the carbon world of fake carbon being labeled as real carbon and being sold. And, we're in the exact same point now in history that we were, say, in the early, 2000s, right? When if you could see it coming, you could have said, actually, these rating schemes are just rubbish. I think, that's what should have been done in the early 2000s to say, look, these ratings and the way things are being run is absolute rubbish. And we need much better and much more accountable, open source and transparent ways of assessing risk and hazard and identifying it and managing it appropriately. And I think the exact same moment is happening now in carbon, where we need to say, look, till now, there's too many shady carbon projects being sold as real. We need to get really real about this and very serious, dead serious. And so what we've done is we've reached out to the two main voluntary carbon market standards that are essentially run by foundations, and they're accountable to their stakeholders, which are large environmental NGOs, human rights NGOs, and they're affiliated with several UN agencies. Now, what we've said to them is, we'd like to help share this technology in an open source way, so that the verification standards can be upgraded to take into account this more regular transparency and fact checking to see if this carbon reduction is real. And we're getting very positive feedback from at least one of the major standards. The other standard, I've got to say, is a little bit standoffish, and I think over time, if people do not adopt this level of transparency, I think the smart companies, smart governments, smart citizens will start saying, look, if you don't have this level of transparency and regularity in the checking of the truth of the claims, then it's really not worth the paper or the digital certificate it's written on, and you can't count that as being real. And I think that's where we're getting to. So we need to get to that point, and I think probably the EU probably will come out with a taxonomy like it has for sustainable finance, and it will start to have a taxonomy that says, thou shalt do this if you want to be recognized as really having some climate impact or some green impact. Otherwise, it's not really sustainable. And I think that's ultimately will probably start to happen across many different regions, and governments and corporates will start adopting it because there's leadership is needed on this matter urgently.
I can see a second hand up. That's Jeff Lynn, and I think we'll stop there with questions. Otherwise, there will not be any group. But Jeff, go ahead, and Tom, be brief on the response to that question. That may be a bit technical, I'm afraid.
So, oh no, it'll be a very brief answer actually. Tom, this is very exciting, and moved on a long way since we were last in touch. Clearly. Very exciting indeed. Roughly what scale are we talking about? I mean, how many how much money have you mobilized so far? How many farmers are involved? How many projects are involved? Can you just give us some idea of how far along the road you are in that way?
Sure. So the number of farmers that we've got signed up and pledged their carbon, it's getting into the hundreds of thousands now. So it's quite big. The amount of capital that has gone into carbon payments is in the hundreds of thousands of euros. And we're in the process of negotiating several billions of euros worth of carbon projects across the world through signed partnerships and agreements. There's a pipeline of about $40 billion of carbon projects and carbon finance that we've identified through partnerships. And we've been doing a pilot with Swedbank, a large Nordic bank. Been doing some work with multilateral development banks, and that they're all sort of in the realm of billions of dollars sort of pipeline.
Thank you.